The order. The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion. This House censures the Prime Minister for his statement that al-Qaeda is praying for a Democratic Party candidate to win the next United States presidential election. 2, his false statement today in Parliament that his statement yesterday was restricted to one US senator and not to the Democratic Party as a whole. 3, the damage that this partisan comment has done to the United States-Australia alliance and to Australia's relationships with both American Democratic and Republican members of the Congress. And 4, the gross insensitivity of lecturing the United States presidential candidates on Iraq when the war in Iraq is responsible for the deaths of more than 3,000 US servicemen and women, the wounding of another 20,000 and expenditures exceeding $360 billion, and finally demands that the Prime Minister unreservedly withdraws this remark.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted. The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How can the man who is Prime Minister of this country come into this parliament and say that he is a person of experience on the question of national security when, within the last 24 hours, he has made this statement, that when it comes to the operation of al-Qaeda and its dealings in the world of international affairs today, that somehow al-Qaeda is a terrorist organisation that would prefer to see a Democrat win the next presidential elections rather than any other representative of another political party. The Prime Minister today has inserted that, in fact, he was only making a reference to Mr Obama, one of the US Democratic Party presidential candidates. It's important that we place this unequivocally on the record. Yesterday, the Prime Minister was asked this question in relation to the Obama plan. Yes, I think he's wrong. I mean, he's a long way from being President of the United States. I think he's wrong. I think that would just encourage those who wanted completely to destabilise and destroy Iraq and create chaos and victory for the terrorists to hang on and to hope for Obama victory. If I was running al-Qaeda in Iraq, I would put a circle around March 2008 and pray as many times as possible for a victory, not only for Obama, but also for the Democrats. That is not an addition invented by the Australian Labor Party. That's not an addition invented by anybody else. That was spoken yesterday, or would we dare say misspoken yesterday, by the Prime Minister of Australia on a matter of great consequence. That is the future of this country's relationship with the United States, particularly on the question of the future direction of Iraq policy. To accuse the Democratic Party of the United States as being al-Qaeda's party of choice, to accuse the Democratic Party as being the terrorists' party of choice, this is a most serious charge. To accuse the party of Roosevelt, to accuse the party of Truman, to accuse the party of Kennedy and Johnson of being the terrorist party of choice. I cannot understand how any responsible leader of this country can say to the nation that it is his serious view that the Democratic Party of the United States is the terrorist party of choice. But these are your words, Prime Minister. I did not invent them. They are yours. And in this parliament today, we gave you every opportunity to say that you got it wrong.
The Leader will refer his marks through the Chair.
We gave the Prime Minister every opportunity to say that it was wrong. That's right. It may have been that he got caught up in the flurry of the interview. It may have been that he didn't hear it clearly. It may have been that he didn't understand it clearly. I understand that these things can happen. But when you are given not once but twice but on 3 separate occasions in this place today an opportunity to say, I got that wrong, I didn't mean that, and for him to pass each one of those up, I think says much about the partisan nature with which this Prime Minister now views the relationship with our great American ally. Let us be absolutely clear about what is at stake here, not just an attack on a single US senator, but an attack upon an entire political party. And here is where Australia's national interest kicks in. This party, the Democratic Party, currently controls the majority in the United States House. It controls the majority in the United States Senate, and within a year or so's time may control the White House itself. And this is the party which this Prime Minister in this country and this Parliament today has reaffirmed he describes as the terrorist party of choice. This is a serious matter. Prime Minister, could you imagine if I stood up in this Parliament as the alternative Prime Minister and said to the people of Australia that the terrorists would be advantaged if the Republicans were to return to the White House at the next presidential election? Ponder for a moment how that would be regarded. How would it be seized on by those opposites? If I stood at this dispatch box, if I appeared on national television and said that the Republicans, if they won, would cause an eruption of joy on the part of al-Qaeda and the part of the terrorists, can you imagine the reaction from those opposite? This is a grave mistake, and I fear that it reflects a deep view on the part of the Prime Minister in terms of those he may not share a view within the US political system. Prime Minister, you have said much in recent times about your experience for this job. Would an experienced Prime Minister have said something like this? No. Would an experienced Prime Minister have said something as irresponsible as this? Would an experienced Prime Minister have said something as reckless as this? I would say, Prime Minister, that these sorts of remarks reflect that on these questions you are prepared to allow partisan considerations to enter into the debate about this country's long-term national security interests. It goes to the core question of what an experienced person should and should not do if you are charged with the high office of being the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia. And this at a time, this is not an idle debating point, this is now a matter for active debate right around the world. On CNN and the US domestic body politic, you've got Democratic congressmen and Republican congressmen making public remarks and reacting against this Prime Minister's statement. It is not a mild, indirect, academic debating point of whether this is of consequence to stand in this Parliament and say that the alternative presidential party of the United States of America is somehow within the thrall of terrorists. That's where this ultimate argument goes. Prime Minister, this, like your remarks last week, was a grave error of judgment. This was a grave error of prime ministerial judgment. A grave error of prime ministerial judgment when we expect something more of our Prime Minister. But let us go also to the question of truth. In this Parliament we've become used to a Prime Minister who, when he says that black is white and white is black, that I didn't say that, but in fact I said this, that somehow, by virtue of his declaration, it's all better. And on 2 occasions today in the Parliament he said, I did not say that he intended any generic critique of the Democratic Party. He said on 2 occasions he was referring only to an individual. He then said it was only a reference to Senator Obama and not a generic reference to the Democratic Party. There is no way you can read this more clearly than it is rendered here at present. He says, I would put a circle around March 2008 and pray as many times as possible for a victory not only for Obama but also for the Democrats. Prime Minister, you are found out in this debate for not telling the truth. And I would say, Prime Minister, given the nature of this censure, as it goes to not just the content of your competence in dealing with the United States on these matters and the prospective alternative administration of the United States, it also goes to a core question of truth. That's right. Because you cannot simply stand there and perhaps, Prime Minister, after a decade or more in office, the Prime Minister has become used to this, to stand at a dispatch box and declare that X is Y and Y is X, when we all know it is not the case, that it is not the truth. You are caught out, Prime Minister, by the text of what you said yesterday. However, you and the spin doctors may choose to represent it or misrepresent it in the general political debate of this country. When it comes to the
member for Flinders is warned.
So my charge around the censure motion, Mr. Speaker, is along these lines. It has been not an act of experience, not an act of competent foreign policy, but in fact a reckless act to make such an extraordinary statement about the alternative administration of the United States. Secondly, my charge is that this Prime Minister has misled the Parliament today by what he has said in trying to pretend that his statement yesterday had nothing to do with a generic attack on the United States Democratic Party. But there is another matter as well, Mr Speaker, and it goes to the consistency of this Prime Minister's parliamentary record. This Prime Minister, on an early occasion, stood at the dispatch box in response to a question from his own side and provided the Labor Party and provided the nation with a lecture about how people should behave. And the lecture was along these lines. Let me say at the outset, he said, that criticism of American policy and criticism of the policies of an American president are of course perfectly legitimate for any political leader in Australia. But it is not in our national interest to make that kind of damning, personal, generic statement of criticism of the current President of the United States. Why not of an alternative President of the United States? And he goes on to say that these attitudes were driven more by tribal political considerations than by anything else. He goes on to say further, the reality is that the Leader of the Opposition at the time has allowed his tribal dislike because of the politics of the current American president to overwhelm his concern for the national interest. Irrespective of who that president may be, it is never in the interest of this country to have that kind of generic criticism made. I repeat, out of this Prime Minister's mouth this statement, it is never, repeat, never in this country's interests to have that kind of generic criticism made. Well, Prime Minister, when you say
order.
that
The Leader of the Opposition
when the Prime Minister says
the Leader of the Opposition resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition resume his seat. I have repeatedly reminded the Leader of the Opposition the standing orders are quite clear that he must direct his remarks through the chair. I call the Leader of the Opposition.
When the Prime Minister repeatedly says, and said in this statement yesterday, which he's reaffirmed on a number of occasions today, that his attack on the policies concerning Iraq applies not just to Senator Obama but to the Democratic Party as a whole, that is by definition a generic attack. It is a generic attack on the alternative administration of the United States in terms of the White House, and it's a generic attack on the party which currently controls the United States House and the Senate. Yet this Prime Minister stands at that dispatch box 3 years ago and provides us, the opposition, with a lecture which says that it is never in the interests of this country to have a kind of generic criticism, that kind of generic criticism made. Prime Minister, let us reflect on how these things are being deliberated upon in the councils of the Democratic Party today. It's not just Senator Obama who will be a candidate for the next presidential election through the US Democratic Party primaries. There's also Senator Clinton. There's Senator Edwards. All these individuals have different policies on Iraq. We may agree or disagree with elements of them. We do not know who ultimately will be the Democratic Party's candidate for the President of the United States, the most important and powerful office in the world. But we do know this: there will be one Democratic Party candidate. And the designation which we attach to that candidate's name when American citizens go to their ballot boxes will be Democratic Party. And the Prime Minister of Australia has said that that Democratic Party, the great party of American politics, the party which led America during the Second World War, the party with which John Curtin formed this alliance in 1941, that great party, the Democratic Party of the United States, this Prime Minister of Australia has said effectively is the preferred party of terrorists. That is what this Prime Minister has said. When you go to the reaction that we've had from the United States simply overnight, given these remarks were only made 24 hours or so ago, they are quite extraordinary. We have Democratic Senator Ron Wyden saying the most charitable thing that you can say about Mr Howard's comment is that it's bizarre. We'll make our own judgments in this country with respect to elections, and Barack Obama is a terrific public servant. But lest it be assumed that we are making some partisan recourse to a Democratic Party critique, of this Prime Minister's foreign policy pronouncements, let us also see what leading Republicans have said. Texan Republican, known to be a very conservative state, Texas, Texan Republican Senator John Cornyn says, quote, "I would prefer that Mr Howard stay out of our domestic politics." Texan Republican, "I would prefer that Mr Howard stay out of our domestic politics, and we will stay out of his domestic politics," unquote. You see, you have comments now of that type, of that calibre, of that content, ricocheting around the US body politic, and the Prime Minister assumes that this is just a trifling matter. It doesn't have an effect. Well, Prime Minister, when it comes to the operations of the Congressional Liaison Office at our embassy in Washington, and the Prime Minister is aware of its operations as much as I am, it has to deal on a day-to-day basis with members of the Congress, members of the House and members of the Senate, including these individuals as well. And now the obstacle that they'll confront as they go into the door to lobby on behalf of Australian farm interests, represented by the National Party from time to time, represented by other key elements of the Australian economy, they will now have this threshold problem to deal with. You're from the country whose Prime Minister says that our party is the preferred choice of terrorists. Now, Prime Minister, that presents an operational obstacle to our men and women in the field. I do not understand, Prime Minister, how you can remain stubborn and standing by those statements simply to preserve your own political reputation from yesterday. The national interest, Mr Speaker, demands that the Prime Minister account to the Parliament properly and use this forum, which the nation gives us, to set the record straight. Prime Minister, if the Prime Minister did not mean that, Prime Minister, stand at this dispatch box and say that your Prime Minister got it wrong. Prime Minister, a week ago, the Prime Minister did this on the question of climate change. The Parliament's challenge to the Prime Minister to do today is the same when it comes to Iraq. If a week ago the Prime Minister could marshal the courage to come in here and say that on climate change when he got it wrong, the challenge for the Prime Minister today is to do the same on Iraq. When we look at the future and we look at how this Iraq debate is going to unfold in the period ahead, one thing is for certain: our alliance with the United States is critical. It's no secret that we on this side of the House voted against the Iraq war, and we did so proudly, having considered the arguments which were put by the government and the administration at the time. The decision taken at that stage was absolutely right. It was voted on by every member of this House. We, the Labor Party, voted to a woman and a man against it. They on that side voted for it. 4 years down the track, let us think about where this war has got us. The Prime Minister has invested $2 billion of Australian taxpayers' dollars in this war. This war has become the greatest single foreign policy and national security policy disaster that our country has seen since Vietnam. This Prime Minister said that our troops would be in Iraq for a matter of months. That was 4 years ago. This Prime Minister said that the purpose of the Iraq war was to reduce the global terrorist threat. It has done the reverse. This Prime Minister said we had to go to war to eliminate Iraqi chemical and biological weapons. And what turned out to be the case was that there were no such weapons. The Prime Minister's debating point is that those on this side of the House took the Prime Minister at his word. Prime Minister, here's the difference. Here's the difference. We on this side did not believe there was a sufficiently strong case to go to war. You on that side took that decision. That's the difference. This hollow debating point about the evidentiary basis at the time, because there were still ultimately concerns about the possibility of other diplomatic opportunities through the United Nations, through Hans Blix, to get to the final truth of this matter. We said we don't think you should go to war. Prime Minister, you took the government to war. That's what it ended up as being. And all these years down the track, 4 years down the track, not even the faintest evidence of anything approaching an exit strategy. Against every measure and standard which this government's constructed for success in Iraq, months, not years, ensuring that terrorism would be reduced, not increased, eliminating weapons of mass destruction which did not exist. Against every measure which has been set, it has been a rolled gold, first-class foreign policy failure. And despite all of that, we have a Prime Minister who stands before the nation yesterday and then provides a public lecture to the American body politic about how this war should now be conducted. Prime Minister, it's time that some members of the government began to hang their heads in shame when it comes to this war, because it has been nothing short of a public policy disgrace. One other thing which is always left out of this debate on Iraq is the other argument used post facto by the Foreign Minister and others was that this was a war to liberate and oppress people. Prime Minister, I'm not quite sure how we justify selling that message to the 60,000+ Iraqi civilians who now lie dead since the war. and the number itself is open to dispute. Is it 60,000 or, as the British Lancet Journal said, up to 600,000? This is a huge debate about the civilian carnage which has been wreaked upon this country. And in the first months of this war, when some of this carnage was at its height, this government, through this Prime Minister, became one of the operating and controlling powers within Iraq responsible for the continuing protection of the civilian population. Against all those measures, Prime Minister, this war is a rolled gold disaster. The alliance, which is the subject of our debate today, has survived since 1941. We in the Labor Party are proud of this alliance because we formed it. And this alliance has survived and prospered under 13 Prime Ministers, Labor and Liberal. It has survived under 12 US Presidents, Republican and Democrat. It has survived and prospered because we have all, at the end of the day, chosen to refrain from the worst forms of partisan comment of the type that we have seen from the Prime Minister yesterday, particularly from the office of Prime Minister. When it comes to the future of this alliance, Prime Minister, my challenge to you is this: to make sure that your personal relationship with the President of the United States does not get to the stage that it actually interferes with the future operation of the alliance.
Leader of the
Prime Minister, you stand
expired.
censured.